The cameras turned on, and the studio of Jimmy Kimmel Live instantly filled with the familiar hum of applause. Tonight's episode was special, and Jimmy Kimmel was well aware of it. This wasn't just another chat with a Hollywood star or a popular musician. Today, a man who is literally changing the course of history was joining him in the studio. A man everyone is talking about, Elon Musk. "Good evening, friends," Jimmy began with his signature smile, scanning the audience. His voice was confident, but there was a spark of excitement in it that hadn't left him even after dozens of shows. Tonight, we have a guest who seems to have found a way to not only transform the automotive industry, but, who knows, maybe the planet itself. And he's also dreaming of colonizing Mars as if it were his next big business project. Please welcome Elon Musk. The room erupted in applause, and Elon walked onto the stage, moving calmly and confidently, like a man accustomed to attention and unusual situations. He was dressed in his standard attire, nothing extravagant, with that same unshakable expression that made those around him certain. He wasn't here to please or pander. "Elon, great to see you," Jimmy said, extending his hand. "You're the guy who's managed to make people believe in electric cars and rockets with humans on board, and now you're planning to populate Mars. How do you find time for it all?" Musk shook the host's hand with the same calm he used when speaking with world leaders. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze attentive, but not overly open. Everything he said always seemed calculated and deliberate. "You know, Jimmy, I've always been curious about how these kinds of projects can shift perspectives," he said. "But to be honest, I just do what interests me, and what interests me is the future. It's always been changing, and I want to be part of that process to make it better for everyone." "Yeah, sure, the future," Jimmy said, playing with his words. "I recently read a news story that President Donald Trump said, essentially, that he doesn't need you. Officially. He said there's no place for you in his plan for the country, that he's got enough people to solve all the problems. As someone who's always striving to be at the forefront, what do you think about that?" Jimmy's words cut through the atmosphere like lightning. The audience froze for a moment, and a faint shadow of tension flickered across Musk's face, but he quickly regained his usual composure. He looked at Jimmy, paused briefly, then responded, "You know, Jimmy, I'm not looking for approval from the president or anyone else. I didn't come here to please anybody. I need to do what I think is important. If Trump thinks he doesn't need me, then he just doesn't understand what I'm doing," Elon said, calmly adjusting his jacket. "I don't work for people. I work for the future." "Of course, the future," Jimmy repeated, chuckling. "You're working for the future, Elon, and it seems like you don't care at all about what those in power think of it. You talk about technology, about rockets in space, but it just so happens that right now, politics seems to matter more than science. How do you deal with that?" Musk leaned forward slightly. "You always manage to steer me toward questions that make me think, Jimmy. But I believe that if we don't keep moving forward, if we don't create, explore, and change, we'll never get there. Yes, politics and power can play a role, but when you build something that changes lives, it works even without someone's approval." I agree, of course," Jimmy said, raising a hand as if shielding himself from the oncoming future. "But here's what's interesting. You're not just an entrepreneur. You're someone trying to build your projects and disrupt established systems. What do you want to change in the world, and why is it so important right now?" "You know, it's simple," Elon replied, sounding a bit more sincere. "I want us to stop relying on old, inefficient technologies, to have more clean energy, to use electric cars instead of polluting our planet. We've created a lot of these solutions, and I think in the future, people will probably be grateful for it." Jimmy leaned forward, smiling wryly. "What a twist! We'll all be thanking you, Elon, for clean air and a supercar for everyone. But here's what I'm curious about. When are you going to make it so your cars can finally go at least 400 kilometers on a single charge? Because I recently saw a Tesla that broke down halfway and decided to take a break at a charging station all on its own. The audience burst into laughter, and Elon Musk, despite a slight smirk, didn't change his expression. He knew these kinds of questions were coming and was used to his projects being criticized. "Yeah, sure," Elon said with a smile. "Technology isn't perfect, and yes, we've had issues, but we're solving them, and with every step, we're getting better." Jimmy, playfully shaking his head, said, "Well, as always, step by step. I'm just worried that the next rocket will launch into space and then decide to take a pause on the way and come back to Earth to recharge. Who would have thought the future could be so funny?" The room roared with laughter again, but Musk remained calm. "You're right, Jimmy. The future can indeed be funny," he replied, smiling. "But I'm confident that in a couple of years, you'll look back at these old jokes and wonder why people didn't realize that the future we're building is what will change everything." Jimmy paused for a moment, then winked at the audience with a grin. "Well, Elon, keep building that fantastic world. Who knows, maybe in a couple of years I'll be looking at my old car and wondering why it doesn't turn into a Tesla with automatic recharging." After Jimmy added fuel to the fire with his sarcastic remarks, the atmosphere in the studio became noticeably tense. Jimmy knew that Elon Musk wasn't someone easily rattled, but he also knew that his job wasn't just to ask questions, it was to create moments that made the audience hold their breath. And tonight, he was ready to test the limits of even the most unflappable entrepreneur. "So, Elon," Jimmy began, clearly intending to take the conversation to a new level. "You keep talking about building the future, and it sounds incredible. But here's what I'm wondering. If you're so good at building the future, why do your rockets sometimes decide that flying isn't really their thing? You know, I've always been curious how you manage to sell failed startups with such confidence. And what happens if the next rocket launches into space and then decides to come back home after a couple of minutes?" The audience erupted in laughter again. Jimmy was, as always, on top of his game, but Musk remained unshaken. He felt the question stung, but he didn't let himself fall for the provocation. "You're right, that's been tough, of course," Elon replied, striving to stay calm. "But mistakes don't break us. They teach us. Every failure is a chance to take the next step." "A step? Jimmy said, shaking his head. "Are you saying your rockets are just lessons for humanity? That the next rocket to launch will be like a festive surprise, rather than an epic saga where every launch is a lottery?" Elon looked at him, still maintaining his composure, though his lips tightened noticeably. "You're always joking, Jimmy," Elon said with a slight smirk. "But when you talk about what happens with rockets, you forget one thing. We're moving forward. And yes, there may be crashes along the way, but the important thing is, we don't give up." "Oh, absolutely," Jimmy said, flashing his playful smile again. "But here's the thing, Elon. I'm curious if you really think the people buying Teslas aren't worried about their cars stopping at the worst possible moment. You want to change the world, but maybe start with making sure the charger works as advertised." The room filled with laughter once more, but Musk held his ground, even though Kimmel's words were starting to get under his skin. He knew criticism was part of life, but his projects didn't deserve to be seen solely as punchlines. "Listen, Jimmy," Elon said, his voice still calm. "You keep joking, but if I listened to people like you, I'd never have achieved what I have. Everything we're building isn't just to check a box. It's to show people what's possible. Yes, Teslas aren't perfect. Yes, we make mistakes. But if we didn't take these steps, we'd be stuck in the past." Jimmy squinted, noticing how seriously Elon was taking the conversation. He knew Musk wasn't one to cave to provocations, but that only fueled the host's desire to keep pushing. Okay, you've convinced me," Jimmy said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tesla is the future, But I just can't help asking, when will your rocket be ready to launch to Mars? Do you really think it'll carry not just your supporters, but regular people who just want to avoid being stranded on the highway by their electric car? You really want to ask that question? Elon replied, raising an eyebrow slightly, though his face remained calm. If you knew how many people already believe in what we're doing, you wouldn't ask questions like that. Maybe, Jimmy said, smiling as he leaned back in his chair. But let's not forget that it's not just people who believe. It's fans who are still waiting for you to do something that truly blows our minds. Because if you end up coming back to Earth with another failed rocket, you'll have to explain to everyone how your version of a Martian ecosystem works. Musk gave in to the tension, but didn't lose his confidence. I know a lot of people might laugh or not believe, but in the end, those who move forward change the world. And if someone thinks it's too ambitious, maybe they just don't see the whole picture. Well, Elon, Jimmy said, pausing, you keep building that future, and I get it, of course. But here's what I'm wondering. If your rocket doesn't make it to Mars, are you ready to explain to everyone why they couldn't buy an electric car that at least doesn't break down halfway? The audience burst into laughter again. Musk softened his emotions slightly, but tension was visible in his eyes. He knew this was part of Jimmy's show, but sometimes the jokes cut too deep. I'm sure you'll find something to laugh about, Jimmy, even if everything's fine, Elon said, holding back. But I'm moving forward, and in the end, the future will show who's right. The room gradually quieted, and despite the light atmosphere Jimmy created, the tension between him and Elon didn't dissipate. Everyone understood that the conversation wasn't just about jokes and jabs. It was a discussion about the future, about ideas that could change the world, and about who would bring those changes to life, and how. With another smirk, Jimmy continued, You know, Elon, you always sound so confident, like your projects aren't just startups, but the very meaning of life for humanity. But here's what I'm curious about. If tomorrow you face millions of people who can't afford your car, can't afford a charger, can't afford a ticket on your rocket, what will you say to them? Musk didn't respond immediately. He wasn't one to wear his emotions on his sleeve, but Jimmy's words touched on an aspect of his vision that often lingered in the background. This wasn't a conversation about technology or business. It was about people. I understand that there will always be those who can't access what we're building, Elon said, his voice softening slightly. But what we're creating today lays the foundation for those things to become available to everyone in the future. Yes, it might take time, but that's the reality. To change the world, you have to start with the first step, and that step is often the hardest. Jimmy chuckled, tilting his head. Sure, we all know the first step is always the toughest part. But here's what I'm wondering. You keep talking about the future like we're all ready for it. What if we're not? What if tomorrow people can't figure out how to live with the technologies you're creating? Don't you think that could be a problem? You're trying to get under my skin again, Jimmy, Elon said, but there was a slight firmness in his voice now. I understand your questions, but they're a bit superficial. We have to move forward. Yes, there will be those who don't get it, but that's always been the case. When people in past centuries started building the first cars, they didn't think everyone would drive them. They thought it was just a miracle that not everyone needed. But they kept moving forward, and look what happened. Yeah, I get it, Elon, Jimmy said, holding back a laugh. But you don't seem to get it. People back then didn't live in a world where every new car wasn't just a piece of metal on wheels, but also a huge money pit you have to pay for out of your own pocket. You talk about the future, but how do people who simply can't afford your products perceive it? Musk looked at Jimmy, his gaze hardening but still controlled. We can't be held back by what people think right now. Of course, not everyone can afford our cars or technologies right away. But that doesn't mean we should stop. If you don't move forward, you stay behind. And you probably think everything you do is absolutely flawless? Jimmy asked, tilting his head with a smile. You do remember how many times your rocket launched and, well, let's just say there were more adventures than you expected? Yes, I remember, Elon replied, his face calm now, though his eyes showed a bit more tension than usual. Failures are part of the process. We learn, we grow. But if you don't try, you'll never know what's possible. Jimmy, seeing Musk getting more serious, decided to lighten the mood a bit. All right. I don't want you to think I'm against what you're doing. Honestly, all these rockets and cars are cool. But tell me, Elon, when will we finally get a Tesla that can go at least 500 kilometers on a single charge? I was driving one of your cars recently and was shocked when it stopped at 150 kilometers. The audience laughed again, and Musk, despite his restraint, couldn't help but smile. You keep up with your jokes, Jimmy, he said, though his voice had lost some of the lightness it had at the start. But if you looked at what we're doing from a technology perspective, you'd see that even those 150 kilometers are a step forward. I promise you, we're working toward cars that can go much farther, and it's not just a goal, it's what we're striving for. Jimmy looked at Elon closely. He could tell Musk was sincere. He believed in what he was doing, and it showed. But that didn't stop Jimmy from continuing his jabs. He knew Musk was a man of action, while he himself was a man who thrived on the show and the reactions. Here's what I'm curious about, Elon, Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair. You're so ambitious that you want to change not just Earth, but Mars too. So I'm wondering, when do you plan to tear us away from this dirty, stuck-in-the-past world with all its problems and poverty? Or are you just going to leave us in the dust and fly off to Mars saying, "There, I did it, now it's your turn"? Musk, despite all his past strides, was starting to get a bit nervous. He knew Jimmy wasn't just a host joking for laughs. He understood that this conversation was a challenge, not just to him, but to everything he was working on. I'm not going anywhere, Elon said, a bit more firmly than before. I'll be here, working, pushing technology forward, and I hope the future I'm building will be accessible to everyone who wants to be part of this world. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, as if lost in thought. He looked at Elon, realizing this man truly believed in his mission, and that, perhaps, was his greatest strength, his belief in what he was doing. Well, all right, Jimmy said, looking up. I guess I agree with you. We're all, maybe, on the verge of something bigger. But here's the question. Whose side will you be on in the future, Elon? The side of those who are ready to move forward despite all the failures? Or the side of those who just aren't ready to accept that the world is changing? The room fell silent. Everyone watched Elon, his face, his gaze, now filled with determination. He knew that everything he was doing wasn't just projects or business. It was the future he believed in. I'm on the side of those who move forward, who aren't afraid of change, Elon said, not breaking eye contact with Jimmy. And I think that's what the future will be. Get ready. As the final applause died down and the camera focused back on Jimmy, his expression grew a bit more serious. He looked at the audience, which sat in silence, processing everything that had just been said. This was a moment when the words, jokes, and jabs could fade, but the questions raised in the conversation remained alive and urgent. Jimmy knew this discussion didn't end in the studio. And that's a wrap, Jimmy said, his voice more reflective than usual. Tonight, Elon Musk and I tried to peek into the future, a world where rockets fly, cars run on electricity, and we might all be sipping tea on Mars. But you know what? While we laugh and talk about his ambitions, while we build expectations, we don't stop to think that all these steps forward might leave us right where we are now. Jimmy paused, his gaze deepening, as if he wanted every viewer to reflect on the words he'd just spoken. He turned to the camera and continued. We all love jokes and jabs, and I'm no exception. But don't forget that behind these projects isn't just an ambitious entrepreneur, but a man who believes his ideas can change the world. And here's the question. If the world is really changing, are you ready to follow that change, or would you rather stay in your comfort zone? Yes, it might all sound distant and foreign, but is it really? Jimmy scanned the audience, inviting everyone to think. Whose side are you on, friends? The side of those trying to change the world despite all the challenges, risks, and mistakes, or the side of those who want to preserve the old system because it's easier, safer, and more familiar? Elon Musk sets goals that seem unbelievable, and maybe his projects and solutions are far from perfect, but perhaps they are the future. Or maybe we're just not ready for change. He raised a finger, emphasizing his final question. The choice is always ours, to be the ones who step into the future or the ones who fear change, stay put, and fight for the old system. It all depends on how we perceive these ideas. Jimmy smirked and winked at the camera. So, whose side will you be on, friends? The progressive one, where every step forward demands courage, or the side of those who prefer the safety of the familiar world? Write in the comments, and let's think about it together. The room was quieter than ever. Everyone was lost in their thoughts, pondering how far they were willing to go, not just to adapt to a new world, but to actively shape it. Jimmy, smiling again, added, "Remember, there's always room in the world for those who believe in change. But on the other hand, stay with those who hold your hand, even if it all seems impossible for now. Who knows, maybe one day we'll end up on Mars. But the main thing is not to forget that it all starts with taking the first step." The camera slowly pulled back, and the studio lights dimmed. It was as if the moment on stage invited each of us to reflect. Who are we, really? Whose side are we on, and what are we willing to do for the future awaiting us?